The morning of January 15th, 1919, dawned with a strange and deceptive warmth over Boston's North End. In this dense, vibrant enclave, the city's Little Italy, life spilled onto the narrow streets. Workers headed for the bustling waterfront, their voices mingling with the cries of vendors and the clatter of horse-drawn carts. Children, released from school for their midday meal, played games in the unseasonable 40-degree weather. Looming over this scene of everyday life was a monstrous steel cylinder, a silent, brooding character in the neighborhood's daily drama. It stood 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, a hulking metal behemoth that blotted out the sky. This was the Purity Distilling Company's molasses tank, and it was a constant, ominous presence. The tank was known to weep. From its seams, a thick, sweet, dark brown syrup perpetually oozed, trickling down its colossal sides. This flaw was so well known, so integrated into the fabric of the neighborhood, that it had become a local ritual. North End children would gather at its base with pails and sticks, scooping up the sticky residue for a free sweet treat. What they saw as a harmless quirk was, in fact, a deadly warning sign. The tank groaned and rumbled, haunted sounds that locals had learned to ignore. When residents complained about the constant leakage, the company's response was not to fix the structural flaw, but to conceal it. Purity Distilling, a subsidiary of the powerful United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, simply ordered the tank painted a deep molasses brown, a cynical coat of paint to mask the evidence of its own negligence. The monster in their midst was bleeding, and its owners chose to hide the wound rather than heal it. On that unseasonably warm January day, the weeping would stop, and the groaning would give way to a deafening roar. The monster would finally break its bonds. This is the story of how one of the world's slowest-moving substances became a 35-mile-per-hour weapon of mass destruction. It is the story of how a simple baking ingredient became an agent of what one report would later call sweet, sticky death. This is a tale of corporate greed, of a city drowned in sweetness, and of the epic legal battle that rose from the wreckage. A fight for justice that would change the face of American industry forever. Welcome to The History Of, where we dig up the surprising stories behind the things you thought you knew. To understand the disaster, one must first understand the world of 1919 Boston. The North End was the city's oldest neighborhood, a densely packed labyrinth of tenements and waterfront businesses that had become the heart of the Italian immigrant community. By 1920, Italian immigrants and their children constituted roughly 90% of the North End's population. It was a world unto itself, vibrant and close-knit, but it was also a community on the margins. In 1919, only about 25% of the Italians living in Boston were American citizens, a reality born of institutional discrimination and steep legal hurdles. This lack of citizenship translated directly into a lack of political power. Their concerns could be, and often were, safely ignored by the civil authorities. It was this very vulnerability that made the North End the ideal location for the United States. Industrial Alcohol Company's massive storage tank. The company, a corporate giant, needed a prime spot with access to both the shipping docks of Boston Harbor and the railway lines that could transport its product to distilleries. Placing a massive, potentially hazardous industrial structure in the heart of a wealthy, politically connected neighborhood would have been impossible. But in the North End, a community of non-voters and recent immigrants, the calculus was different. The company's decision was not merely logistical. It was a calculated act of environmental injustice, offloading immense risk onto a population that lacked the political capital to protest effectively. The product itself, molasses, was the lifeblood of a booming industry. During World War I, industrial alcohol fermented from molasses was a key component in the manufacture of munitions. With the war over, demand had not waned. A new deadline loomed: national prohibition. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on January 16, 1919, the very day after the disaster, and was set to take effect 1 year later. USIA was in a frantic race against time, stockpiling molasses to produce as much industrial alcohol as possible before the nation went dry. The immense pressure to maximize production and profit, coupled with the decision to place the tank in a marginalized community, created a perfect storm of corporate ambition and social disregard. The tank was a catastrophe waiting to happen, a ticking bomb built with a level of negligence that was, in hindsight, breathtaking. It was constructed hastily in 1915 under the supervision of a man named Arthur Schell, USIA's treasurer, who possessed no architectural or engineering experience whatsoever. His priority was the bottom line, not public safety. From its inception, every standard of sound engineering was ignored. A crucial common-sense recommendation to first fill the tank with water to test its integrity and check for leaks was dismissed to save the time and money the procedure would have cost. Had this simple test been performed, the disaster could have been averted. A 2014 engineering analysis revealed the horrifying truth. The steel plates used for the tank's walls were only half as thick as they should have been, even by the far more lenient standards of the day. Furthermore, the steel was critically deficient in manganese, a chemical element that provides strength and reduces brittleness. This made the tank dangerously fragile, particularly in cold weather. The rivet holes, which held the steel plates together, had been punched rather than drilled, a cheaper and faster method known to create dangerous microfractures in the surrounding steel. Warnings were not just theoretical. They were constant and explicit. An on-site manager, Isa Gonzalez, repeatedly raised alarms about the tank's instability. On one occasion, a laborer was so concerned that he brought actual shards of fractured steel that had flaked off the tank's walls directly to a company treasurer as proof of the imminent danger. The manager's response was chillingly dismissive. "I don't know what you want me to do. The tank still stands." A pattern of disregard was clear and consistent, a timeline of unheeded warnings that led directly to the tragedy. By January 1919, the fatally flawed tank was filled near its 2.3 million gallon capacity. The final ingredients for disaster were now added by nature and commerce. The weather in Boston took a dramatic turn. Over a short period, the temperature soared from a frigid 2 degrees Fahrenheit to an unseasonably warm 41 degrees Fahrenheit on the day of the flood. Just days before, a ship had arrived from the warmer climate of the Caribbean, carrying a fresh load of molasses. To pump the thick, viscous liquid from the ship into the storage tank, the new shipment had been warmed to decrease its viscosity. This warm molasses was then pumped into the nearly full tank, which contained a massive volume of older, colder molasses that had been sitting through Boston's frigid early winter. The result was a catastrophic lesson in basic physics. The introduction of the warm liquid caused the cold mass inside to undergo rapid thermal expansion. As the molasses expanded, it created an immense and unforeseen internal pressure, pushing outwards against the brittle, two thin steel walls that were already strained to their breaking point. The ticking bomb, built 4 years earlier out of greed and incompetence, was finally armed. The countdown had reached 0. Shortly after noon, around 12:30 p.m., the North End workers taking their lunch break heard a low, deep rumble. Many at first dismissed it as the familiar sound of an approaching train on the elevated railway that snaked past the tank. But the sound grew, and it was soon joined by something far more terrifying. Witnesses described a rapid succession of sharp, metallic reports, like a volley of machine gun fire, as the steel rivets holding the tank together shot out like bullets. Harold Dorley, an agent for the Boston and Worcester Street Railway, was in his office in a freight house just feet from the tank. He had long feared this exact moment. He later told the Boston Post, "Instinctively, I knew what it was. 3 years ago, I prophesied that the molasses tank would burst someday. "Molasses tank gone," I cried. The words were barely out when the avalanche came. The ground shook violently as the 50-foot-tall steel structure tore itself apart, unleashing 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses in an instant. What erupted from the tank was not a leak or a spill. It was a wave. A black tsunami of molasses, estimated to be between 15 and 40 feet high at its peak and 160 feet wide, exploded into the neighborhood at a speed of 35 miles per hour. Molasses is roughly 40% denser than water, weighing about 12 pounds per gallon. The 2.3 million gallons in the tank weighed approximately 13,000 tons. This immense mass, now moving at high speed, possessed a terrifying amount of kinetic energy. The wave struck with the force of a locomotive. Buildings in its path were swept from their foundations and crushed as though they were made of pasteboard. The steel support girders of the Boston Elevated Railway buckled and twisted, momentarily tipping a train car off the tracks. The destruction was absolute, but the human cost was even more horrific. 10-year-olds Pasquale Iantosca and Maria D'Estasio had been out collecting firewood, enjoying the warm day. They were swept away by the wave and killed instantly. At the Engine 31 firehouse, which stood in the tank's shadow, firefighter George Leahy had just gone to bed after his shift. The wave struck the building, collapsing it and killing him. The home of the Clougherty family was lifted entirely from its foundation and smashed against the railway trestle. 65-year-old Bridget Clougherty was killed inside. Dozens of horses, tethered to their wagons in the paving yard, were powerless to escape. A reporter for the Boston Post wrote a graphic account of their fate. Horses died like so many flies on sticky flypaper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. In the first chaotic moments, help came from the water. 116 cadets from the USS Nantucket, a training ship docked at a nearby pier, heard the crash and rushed toward the scene. They were the first responders, wading into the knee-deep, sticky morass to pull victims from the wreckage. Soon, they were joined by Boston police, firefighters, and Red Cross nurses. The rescue effort was a unique kind of hell. The molasses itself became the primary obstacle. It was a treacherous, viscous trap that coated everything and everyone. Rescuers found their own movements dangerously impeded, and victims were often glued to the debris. The situation grew worse as the day ended. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the molasses began to congeal and harden, entombing the dead and dying and making the rescue effort nearly impossible. The victims, covered head to toe in the dark brown syrup, were often unrecognizable. This was a medical crisis unlike any other. The wave had killed through blunt force trauma, but it also killed through suffocation. At the nearby Haymarket Relief Station, nurses worked frantically to clear the thick, sticky molasses from the mouths and airways of the injured to prevent them from choking to death. The cleanup of the neighborhood took weeks, an arduous process that required a novel solution. Workers discovered that fresh water was ineffective against the hardened goo. Only salt water, pumped directly from Boston Harbor, could effectively break it down. For months, the harbor itself remained stained brown, a lingering reminder of the disaster, and it was not until summer that it finally cleared. In total, the flood killed 21 people and injured 150 more. As the city of Boston grappled with the surreal horror, USIS leadership moved swiftly, not to aid the victims, but to control the narrative. The company immediately and publicly denied any fault. Instead, it propagated a cynical and calculated lie. The tank had been bombed by anarchists. This was not a random accusation. It was a strategy designed to prey on the specific fears of the era. The year 1919 was the height of the first Red Scare, a period of intense anti-immigrant and anti-radical hysteria in the United States. Boston's North End, with its large population of Italian immigrants, was viewed by some authorities as a hotbed of anarchist activity. This fear was not entirely unfounded. A series of real anarchist bombings had targeted officials and businessmen across the country in the spring and summer of 1919. USIA's strategy was to weaponize this climate of fear and prejudice. By blaming a phantom bomb, the company sought to deflect all attention from its own gross negligence. It was a cruel narrative inversion that attempted to turn the primary victims of the disaster, the Italian immigrant community of the North End, into its perpetrators. The company's lie did not hold. In the weeks and months that followed, the families of the 21 people killed and the 150 who were injured began to seek justice. More than 125 separate lawsuits were filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. In a landmark legal move, these individual claims were consolidated into a single massive class action lawsuit, one of the first and largest in the history of Massachusetts. The sheer scale of the case was unprecedented. To manage the litigation, the court appointed a single auditor, Colonel Hugh Ogden, to hear the evidence and determine liability. Ogden was a respected figure, a decorated soldier, and an impartial lawyer, tasked with uncovering the truth behind one of the strangest disasters in American history. The stage was set for a legal battle epic proportions, pitting a community of largely poor immigrants and working-class families against one of the nation's most powerful corporations. The trial began, and it would stretch on for 6 years, from 1919 to 1925. It was a monumental undertaking. Over 3,000 witnesses were called to testify, and the official court record grew to nearly 45,000 pages of testimony and arguments. The plaintiff's legal team pursued a meticulous and damning strategy. Witness by witness, they built an irrefutable case documenting the tank's shoddy construction, the company's long history of ignoring clear warnings, and the catalog of structural failures that made the disaster inevitable. In contrast, USIA's defense rested almost entirely on its unsubstantiated anarchist bomb theory. The company spent more than $50,000, an immense sum for the time, equivalent to over $800,000 today, on expert witnesses to support this claim. Their case was weak. One of their key witnesses, a woman named Winifred McNamara, who claimed she saw smoke rising from the tank, became flustered under cross-examination and ultimately threatened people in the courtroom, destroying her credibility. Metallurgical experts for the defense pointed to the presence of Newman bands in fragments of the tank's steel, a microstructural feature that could, under some circumstances, be caused by an explosion. However, this evidence was highly technical and contested, especially when weighed against the mountain of evidence pointing to simple structural failure. The turning point in the trial came with the testimony of the plaintiff's own expert witness, Charles Spofford, the head of the Civil Engineering Department at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Spofford had conducted a thorough forensic analysis of the tank's wreckage. In court, he presented pieces of the actual tank walls, demonstrating that the steel plates were dangerously thin. He testified that his calculations showed the pressure exerted by the 2.3 million gallons of molasses on the tank's lower rings created a stress of 31,000 pounds per square inch. A safe design, he argued, should never have permitted a stress greater than 18,000 pounds per square inch. His conclusion was unequivocal and devastating to the defense. In my judgment, the tank was improperly designed, and its failure was due entirely to structural weakness. On April 28, 1925, after years of testimony and deliberation, Colonel Ogden delivered his verdict. He found the United States Industrial Alcohol Company completely and solely responsible for the disaster. In his final report, Ogden systematically dismantled the company's defense, stating that there was no credible evidence of an anarchist plot. He ruled that the tank was structurally unsound from the day it was built, and that the company had shown a clear and consistent pattern of negligence. The tragedy, he concluded, could have been and should have been avoided. USIA was ordered to pay damages to the victims and their families. The final settlement amounted to between $600,000 and $1 million, the equivalent of more than $10 million in the 21st century. For the residents of the North End, it was a hard-won and bittersweet victory. The legacy of the Great Boston Molasses Flood extends far beyond the streets of the North End. The disaster and the subsequent verdict served as a powerful catalyst for legal and regulatory reform across the United States. The trial's exhaustive documentation of corporate negligence created a public and political demand for greater oversight. In direct response to the tragedy, Massachusetts passed the first laws in the nation requiring that a licensed, professional engineer and a registered architect sign and seal all plans for major construction projects. Building codes were strengthened, and new regulations were enacted to ensure that public safety would be prioritized over corporate profit. These reforms quickly spread to other states, becoming a cornerstone of modern American construction and engineering standards. The verdict established a vital legal precedent for corporate accountability. It sent a clear message that big business could not simply self-police and would be held financially and legally responsible for the consequences of its actions. The invisible legacy of the flood is present in the safety of nearly every building and bridge constructed in the century since. The legal framework that holds corporations to a duty of care to the public was forged, in part, in the sticky wreckage of Boston's North End. Every blueprint signed by an engineer today is part of the system of accountability born from this disaster. A bizarre and horrific tragedy, born of corporate greed and visited upon a vulnerable immigrant community, ultimately became a landmark moment in the fight for justice and public safety. The disaster also had a profound impact on its survivors. In the decades that followed, the legal victory and the shared trauma galvanized the North End's Italian-American community, spurring an uptick in active citizenship. The number of Italian-American voters in Boston tripled over the next 20 years, as the community claimed the political voice it had previously been denied. Today, a small park and playground stand on the site where the Great Tank once loomed. The sounds of destruction have been replaced by the laughter of children. Yet for decades after the flood, a ghostly reminder of the tragedy remained. Residents of the North End swore that on hot summer days, a faint, sweet, cloying smell of molasses still lingered in the air, a phantom scent of a sweet, sticky death, and a testament to a day that Boston would never forget.